to our event today. We are very excited to be joined by Doctors Johnson and Smith, who have co-authored the books Good Guys, How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace, and Athena Rising, How and Why Men Should Mentor Women. So we're delighted to spend some time with them today. I'm Dr. Jenny Walker, the chair of the Center for Women's Leadership, and thank you as always for taking a valuable hour out of your day to join us. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our esteemed guest. Dr. Brad Johnson is professor of psychology in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law at the United States Naval Academy and faculty associate in the Graduate School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Johnson served as a psychologist at Bethesda Naval Hospital and the medical clinic at Pearl Harbor, where he was the division head for psychology. He's a recipient of the Johns Hopkins University Teaching Excellence Award and has received distinguished mentor awards from the National Institutes of Health and the American Psychological Association. Dr. Johnson is the author of numerous publications, including 13 books. Dr. David Smith is Associate Professor of Sociology in the College of Leadership and Ethics at the U.S. Naval War College. A former Navy pilot, Dr. Smith led diverse organizations of women and men, culminating in command of a squadron in combat, and flew more than 3,000 hours over 30 years, including combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. As a sociologist trained in military sociology and social psychology, he focuses his research in gender, work, and family issues, including gender bias in performance evaluations, dual career families, military families, women in the military, and retention of women. He's the co-author of numerous journal articles and book chapters that focus on gender in the workplace. So a very hearty welcome to both of you today.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. That's all operating properly there. It's great to be here with the whole Forbes community and the whole global campus today, and to share a little bit about our work. And maybe just I'd like to start with a little bit more about how Brad and I got started in doing this work. And we taught for many years together at the Naval Academy, and it was in those early years of our collaboration that we recognized that we had a research connection in terms of Brad's work around mentoring relationships and what make for great mentoring, and my focus on gender, work, and family. The connection there was really around aspects of gender in the workplace and how career developmental resources like mentoring, sponsoring, advocacy, and more other relationships like allyship in the workplace just was not a level playing field, and women didn't have the same access to resources as men. And often the solution to that was to create women's leadership initiatives and programs that focused on women and gender, which is great, but often men would look at that and go, I don't have a role, I don't have a function there. And so they would avoid it. And we think that reframing these as leadership issues where men and women both have roles and responsibilities in terms of creating more equitable workplaces is one way to think about that. As we started our partnership and collaboration, we focused on mentoring and sponsoring first, which led to our first book, Athena Rising, which came out in 2016. Interestingly, about a year later, Me Too went widespread. And as you probably remember, and it drew us into a very different conversation beyond mentoring and sponsoring into the focus of allyship and how do we show up as allies in the workplace? And what did that look like at any level of leadership, whether you're junior or senior in your organization? And how could we really pull together the best practices that women told us that they most appreciated and that men said that they were trying to put into action out there? So that led to our latest book, Good Guys. And we're going to give you a little bit of the best of here today, but let me let Brad share just a little bit about how he went about doing the research for both of the books.
Yeah, great to be with all of you today. And, I will say that when Dave and I first started sharing our idea for doing the research and then writing a book on mentoring women, people would look at us kind of funny and say, wait, you realize you're two men, right? And we really get that. Just so everyone knows, we take a very specific approach to the methodology we use in all of our research, especially the two books that you see here. And what we do is go out and interview lots and lots of women. And these are women across professions, across industries, and ask them, what does it look like for you in your career when a male has really shown up as a terrific mentor sponsor in the case of Athena Rising, or just as a great ally and colleague supporting gender equity in the case of Good Guys? And we're really looking for behavioral samples. What does he actually do that you really appreciate? And in the cases where women nominate men who they think really get it and are exceptional in this area, we often get interviews with those men too, and just try and get a sense of their own self-awareness and how they approach these relationships. So we take the best of, we take the things that occur with the most frequency in our interviews and compile them and want to sort of give them away as a toolbox, especially to men, in terms of how we can show up. So today we'll give you some of the best of from our research.
All right, let's start with some of the research that surrounds the workplace in our organizations. And we know that the more gender diversity we have at every level of the organization, so not just at the bottom, but all the way into our senior leadership teams, into the C-suite and into our boardrooms, the more successful our organizations are. They're more creative, they're more innovative, we make better decisions. And certainly for lots of organizations out there, if you measure your bottom line in terms of profits and losses, we're more profitable. And a lot of this research used to be just correlational, but the latest research, as you see here, is actually we see causal factors as we increase the percentage of women in the senior leadership teams and how it affects a company's profits. Yet we still find that despite the fact that so much of this evidence is so widespread and well known today, that we still see a lot of these disparities and inequities in the workplace, and women are excluded and from recruiting and hiring, and certainly retention, advancement, and promotion, and the gender wage gap is alive and well today. And in lots of the research out there, including ours, we find that most men do believe in gender equity and gender equality, but it doesn't translate into the actions that remove and eliminate some of these inequities that we find in the workplace. But one of the things that's really clear is that when men do engage in doing this work in an organization in the workplace, that it does make a difference.
Yeah, and this is just one of many studies illustrating Dave's point about why men. This is from Boston Consulting, going out across industries, across lots of different companies, and asking women one question: is your company making real progress on gender diversity and the inclusion of women? The number one predictor of whether women said yes or no to this across companies was whether or not they saw men clearly championing and engaging in gender diversity efforts. When that was true, 96% of women said, yep, I see the progress, my company's moving forward, versus only 30% of women when they didn't see men involved.
And part of the understanding of this is really around the allyship gap, in the terms of how just because I believe in something doesn't mean that I'm actually doing the actions and the work to create the results that we're looking for here. And certainly this is one piece of research that Promundo did internationally that shows just some of those aspects of the allyship gap, and that we have a little bit of a belief, aspiration, execution gap here in terms of what allyship is all about. One of the challenges around this and solving this gap is really about awareness and understanding and having an awareness of how women experience the workplace differently than we do as men. And then really turning that into the actions that begin to eliminate those. The other part of this is really about best practices. And in so many ways, many men told us that they were looking for what were the actions that were going to have the most effect in their organization, really best practices, best in class, and for their industry out there, so they could put those into practice now. And so as we did our research, we were really looking for a lot of those tactical strategies that could be used right now or today.
So one of the things that became very, very clear as we were doing the original research for Athena Rising, all about how men can show up as mentors, it became very, very clear in the research and in our own interviews that there are a number of things that tend to keep men on the sidelines, keep us from engaging in these really important developmental relationships with women at work. There were so many of them, we actually kind of gave it a blanket term, reluctant male syndrome. And it included things like anxiety. I don't know what to say or do. I don't want it to land the wrong way. I don't want to step in it. I just don't have a roadmap for this. We actually term this the man script. I I feel comfortable with relationships with my mother, sister, maybe my partner. I have a roadmap for that, but no one ever gave me a manuscript for how to have a close, connected, non-sexual relationship with a woman in the workplace. And that feels foreign, so I just perhaps don't engage. Other men were concerned about rumors and gossip. And then, of course, in 2017, along came Me Too. And you're watching the research from Lean In and Bloomberg, like Dave and I are. And, roughly 60% of men in corporate America post Me Too were saying, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just not comfortable mentoring a woman. There's too much at risk. It's dangerous. It's risky. Women make false accusations all the time against men. This is just flat out not true. Dave and I have actually looked at the data. It is incredibly rare for a woman to make a false accusation about harassment. And we'd love to remind men, Me Too is actually pretty straightforward. Women would love to come to work and not be assaulted or harassed. Really low bar for men to get over. But instead of acknowledging that, we're hearing all these false narratives about women. So men need to be pushing back on this. And if you're a male who has anxiety about interacting with women at work, there's only one cure for that. Take it from me as a clinical psychologist. It's called exposure therapy. More interaction, more engagement, more conversations, more coffee. You just have to have exposure. Last thing that we find, and Dave and I always shake our heads at this a little bit, but there are men who say, yeah, I'm sorry. What if I found her attractive? Wouldn't that be awkward or difficult? And we have a big breakthrough. It actually doesn't need to be that difficult. So it turns out men have a frontal lobe, and the beauty of this is I can be aware somebody's attractive and even appreciate that and still have impulse control and good decision making and professional behavior. We share this tongue in cheek, but I think there's some real truth to this. We need to all work on our exposure therapy and push back on the false narratives.
So as we talk about allyship, I think it's helpful to level the playing field here and just frame this up in terms of what we're talking about, because this may be a new term for some of you, and for others, it may have different meanings about what we're specifically talking about. So the way we like to look at this is that allyship has really three parts. And the first is interpersonal allyship. And you can think about this as really, this is the, how do I show up individually and hold myself personally accountable for the kinds of relationships I have in the workplace, and being collegial, being collaborative, being supportive for the men out there with your female colleagues, and supporting gender equity and fairness. And in many ways, this is really the easy part of allyship, because you only have to worry about yourself. The harder part of allyship that we heard from so many men in the interviews was really about this public allyship, and really feeling like they're putting some skin in the game and maybe accepting a little risk and feeling uncomfortable sometimes because they're putting themselves out there in public and doing this work. And this is not just holding yourself accountable, but now holding others accountable, and people on your team and your leaders. And eventually, as we get to the organizational level, we can begin to think about systemic allyship, and how do we change the everyday practices where bias operates to create inequities like the wage gap or the lack of representation of women in senior leadership ranks? As we begin to understand how this bias operates, we now have a responsibility to begin to think about how do we change those practices in big ways and small ways, but whatever level of leadership we're at, we can begin to take the responsibility to do that. This starts with an awareness of this at each level, of understanding what are the experiences, what are the ways that I can make a difference, and then using our own motivation to do this work. And this happens in lots of ways. It could be personal motivation, it could be something around my leadership or around the business understanding of this in the organization, or it could just be about the moral case, about knowing this is the right thing to do for everyone out there. We also know that gender allyship can also be a gateway into other allyship skills. And we can think about this, we found in our own research as we think about women of color, about how the intersecting identities here, there's an opportunity to translate the broader idea of gender allyship skills into other forms of dimensions of diversity. And we know that, again, just understanding how other people experience the workplace differently helps us to begin to put these allyship skills into practice. The statistics you see here on the slide are from the last couple of years with the McKinsey Women in the Workplace studies. And we can see that, again, women in the workplace women of color in the workplace may have very different experiences than their white female colleagues. And we can use these same allyship skills to begin to address those inequities.
So I just want to note, Tracy has a great question already in the Q&A about, now in the virtual world, are men still reluctant, even though we're not in person? And we're going to get to that, Tracy. That's coming up. We're going to do actually a little demonstration that I think connects to that directly. So let me just kind of point out what's happened during the pandemic. And this is not news to a lot of people. You know that millions of women have been forced out of the workforce. They've been literally forced to choose between continuing to participate at work and take advantage of opportunities there, and all of the caregiving that tends to fall to women. This is especially exacerbated for women of color, Black women, if you disaggregate that data. But one of the things that we find is very clear: before the pandemic, women who are partnered with men were doing at least double the amount of domestic work and childcare. During the pandemic, even though men have been home more, women have been pressed into the triple shift, as Sheryl Sandberg describes it. Now we're adding homeschooling. And men are really, when they're partnered with women, are really just not showing up. A lot of this tends to default to women. One thing should be really, really clear when it comes to gender equity: we are never going to get there. We're never going to close things like the pay gap unless men really start showing up as partners. And this is not just the domestic work. This is all the cognitive emotional stuff too. Keeping lists, planning events, knowing your children's clothing size. This tends to default to women in heterosexual relationships. So we have a message for men. If you really are interested in gender equity and allyship, it really has to begin in your personal relationship. You've got to show up at home. Not sure you're doing this? Go home today and do what we call a domestic audit. Ask your partner, am I really doing my fair share? And then don't get defensive when you get the answer. Just ask or think about, what can I start doing immediately?
And in addition to doing this for our partners, I think one of the other things for the men out there who are parents to think about their role as fathers. And the research is really clear here that when our children see us as dads, being all in equal allies and doing our fair share of the domestic responsibilities, as well as the child care, caregiving, and the emotional aspects of it in relationships, that it makes a difference in the outcomes for our kids. And for our sons, they have a more inclusive perspective of gender roles. And so as they hit the workplace, they're thinking about different ways to combine work and family. And for our daughters, they're more likely to persist in their careers, reach their career goals and dreams, and to enter into non-traditional professions and industries. So if we're ever going to reach gender parity in many of our industries out there, we as dads have to step up at home and do our part. So let's get into some of the best of. We're going to start with the interpersonal allyship first, and thinking about the kinds of relationships and where do we begin to develop awareness. And really, this starts with, as Brad and I like to talk about it, is beginning to enhance or sharpen your GQ, your gender intelligence in this case. And that starts by self-education, attending events like today, reading great books and articles out there. And as you're doing that, as you're listening and reading these, beginning to think about, where are the connections into my own team, into my own workplace? Where do I see some of these same experiences occurring out there? And then maybe having conversations with our colleagues. And to start those conversations, it's really helpful to really approach those with a lot of humility, in the sense that, I don't have all the answers here. I'm trying to maintain a learning orientation and use my curiosity to really learn and to understand, so I can develop some empathy and become a better ally. A lot of the men said that even with that, and approaching some of their closest female colleagues at work, that they still felt like they needed to ask permission. Would it be okay if I ask you about your experiences here? So the ask to ask, would it be okay if I ask about that? And they also said that approaching these with some cultural humility is really helpful too, in the sense that not all women's experiences are the same, just like not all men's. We're not a monolith. And so having some of that cultural humility will go a long way as we think about how intersecting identities may produce some unique experiences for many of our colleagues out there. To close the allyship gap that I mentioned earlier, one of the most critical pieces of information we need, and and behaviors we need as feedback. And in so many ways, allies can do this for each other. As we begin to create a community of allies where we can begin to give each other feedback, then we can see, are we really achieving the kinds of results that we think we are? Just because, again, I believe in it doesn't mean that I'm actually doing the work. We're doing it in a way that it's achieving what I'm looking for. And again, remembering that in many ways we are so imperfect. We're not going to get this exactly right each time, and so we're going to make mistakes along the way. And we need our allies to step in and to help us with getting some of that feedback. Many of the men we talked to said that they had these aha moments when they got this feedback and kind of epiphanies about what they learned, and said it was really important that they share this with their community and with the other men so that, again, they can learn from this as well. And in the same way, share it with other women so we can get another data point. We can see, hey, is this kind of the same experience that you had, or was there something different about this in that way? Brad and I always love to share that even though we've been doing this work for so long, that we still make mistakes along the way, and we're learning things as we go. And we'll always love to share some of those, just in the sense of role modeling some of this and providing some humility. That one of the examples from early in our time together was the title of our first book. And of course, working titles for books are often different, and ours was. And our editor came to us at one point and said, hey, can we talk about the title of the book? And we're like, sure, we'd love to. And the working title was Guiding Athena. And we love the title because guiding is a synonym that's often used for mentoring. And Athena was just a great aspirational metaphor for many of the women that we worked with at the time. And so she said, yeah, can we talk about this? Because have you ever thought about how this might land with a female audience, and that maybe women don't want to be told they need to be guided by a couple of men? And we were like, wow, you just saved us from an epic fail. And so we share that with you with just a little bit of humility here in the moment. The number one thing that women told us that they most appreciated for their male mentors from our first book and for our male allies from the second book were listening skills. And I guess this is one of the shocking surprises that Brad and I had from the research, was that apparently we men are not always the greatest of listeners. And the women were talking about listening in a particular way. They were talking about generous listening to understand, to really begin to develop an awareness and empathize. And as it turns out, sometimes we men will listen for a problem, and then, aha, when I have it, I'll fix it or fix her. Again, things that, again, women don't appreciate. Often women told us that they wanted us to be more of a sounding board. Can you just listen and maybe normalize some of the experiences I have, or validate some of the experiences I have, instead of trying to fix me or my problems?
The assumptions turned out to be a big issue. A lot of men struggled with this. And we have I think our favorite illustration of this came from our interview with Janet Petro, who you see here. She is Deputy Director of the Kennedy Space Center. During our interview, she raved about her mentor. So we got an interview with him. It's Robert Lightfoot, who you see here. He was director of NASA at the time. And he was refreshingly humble. And he said, look, gentlemen, let me just tell you where I got it wrong. A lot early in my career, I would make assumptions about women, right? Just because it's a her, I would assume that she must want this, or she'd never want to do this, instead of actually checking with her. He said, let me give you an illustration. I was on an executive search committee for a key position at NASA. By far, our top candidate was a woman. In that final selection meeting before we offered the job, I wanted to show how gender savvy I was. So I said, this job involves a lot of travel, and she just had a baby. I don't know. And he said, fortunately, there was a woman sitting across from me with daggers coming from her eyes. And she said, Robert, I think she knows this job involves travel. I'm certain she knows she had a baby. So how about if she's our candidate? You don't decide this for her. And he said that was such an epiphany moment. There I was thinking I was being helpful and totally making assumptions. And I've learned to really work on that.
And just like Robert, in the moment, sometimes we get that critical feedback that, again, we need as allies to close the gap. But when we get critical feedback, we may not always respond in a way that shows that we value and we care, and we want more of that feedback. Often we might feel a little defensive or threatened and respond in a way that shows we don't care. So we ask people to think about, how can you have some of these ready responses, things that show that you care, that you're listening, that you understand, and that you want more of this, and just try on maybe just a simple thank you, or I apologize, or that's something I'm trying to work on. Can I come back to you and we can talk about that more later? Because often in that defensive state, we might respond in a way that shows that we don't care, and we may even begin to question her own experiences.
Like these responses, these are incredibly unhelpful. Too many of the women that we interviewed said this actually happens to them somewhat routinely. You know, they'll experience some egregious bias or maybe even some sexual harassment verbally, and they'll share it with a guy. And the first thing out of his mouth is one of these phrases. If you look at them, they're all designed to make her question her perceptions or her sense of reality, or believe that she's blowing things out of proportion. Incredibly unhelpful. And it's not great ally behavior versus something like, I believe you. Could you tell me more about exactly what happened? And I know you don't need me to rescue you, but how could I collaborate with you to make sure this stops or doesn't continue?
So we begin to develop our awareness, and we're getting some of this feedback. We can start putting it into action and really think about developing the situational awareness. And this happens lots of times in the group setting. So this is where we're in meetings, and this is where gender dynamics start to play out. And these meetings could be in the in-person or more likely in the virtual today. And they play out very similarly. And we can start by just looking around and kind of sifting the ambient environment, maybe asking questions to ourselves, like who was invited to the meeting, who was excluded from this meeting, who's leading it, who's the expert in the room, who's getting lots of time to make their argument, and maybe who's getting no time to make any contributions, who's being interrupted 3 times as often, and who's having their ideas valued and who might be having their ideas stolen. I think another one of the surprises that Brad and I heard countless examples from many of the women that we interviewed was about how they would have this great idea. They put it out there to their team. They were excited about it, and it just kind of landed flat. Nobody paid much attention to it. But 30 minutes later, some guy had the same idea now repackaged as his own. And it's like, wow, what a great idea. Way to go. And I know I just remember thinking to myself that, I've never had that happen to me. And I don't remember at the time ever having witnessed that in a meeting. But now that I'm aware of it, I can see it. And when I see it, I can just say, well, wait, I'm sorry. How is that any different than what Mary just said? Or make sure I attach her name to an action item for the next meeting. That's a great idea, Mary. And next meeting, we're going to explore some courses of action and alternatives, some options related to that. And again, one of the surprises here, I think, is that we as men are just not aware sometimes these things are going on around us. And when we are aware, we can do something about it. This is so prevalent, this stealing of ideas, that women have terms for this, and they call it things like bro-appropriation, heap-eating, or imitating. But again, I think it just shows you how prevalent it is, and again, how much more awareness we need as men.
So the mentoring piece really turned out to be absolutely essential. In all of the research we did getting ready to write Athena Rising, it's really clear that, and after the book came out, we'd be speaking to men about mentoring women. And a lot of guys will say things like, really, why do I have to mentor women? Why can't women do this? And the truth of it is, women do mentor other women all the time. But unfortunately, in most organizations, as you go up into senior leadership, there are fewer and fewer senior women to do this. And if you're expecting those women to mentor all the talented women you're bringing through the front door, you're going to burn them out. It's incredibly unfair as a burden. The mathematics just don't work. Men need to lean in here and be very willing and engaged in mentoring junior women. We know that when women have a male mentor, they make more money, they get more promotions. This is not because men are better mentors. We just often hold more power and have more capital to spend in our mentoring relationships. So men do need to lean in, but the type of mentoring really, really mattered here. And the old school traditional guru model of mentoring was seen as aversive to a lot of the women that we interviewed. No, I'm not really interested in that lopsided top down. He's just going to broadcast to me about his experience or tell me what to do kind of mentoring versus something that has a really different character. Actually, this guy was the ideal mentor, was someone who was always saying, I don't know. He was very humble. Let's find out together. And by the way, let me introduce you to some people who might be able to help you here, because I see part of my role as your mentor as introducing and networking and building your constellation. I really would like to make sure I'm not the only source of support in your universe or your network.
As it turns out, when we have more of these relationships, these types of mentoring or allyship or friendship, collegial relationships in the workplace that are not focused on hierarchy or the power that's often laden in those relationships, but more of a give and take, more reciprocal and mutual in nature, the research shows that there's a lot of great benefits that go both directions because learning happens in both directions. And we found that in our own research for Athena Rising, when the male mentors had benefits like increased access to information in their organizations that they wouldn't have otherwise had. They had more diverse networks, both internal and external to the organizations, and then enhanced or better interpersonal skills. So more empathy, higher EQ, better communication skills, all things that made them better leaders, but also at the end of the day, made them better people, parents, and partners.
So I want to just kind of give you a sense that, and Tracy, I want to get back to your question now. You know, you asked a great question about, in this virtual world, are some men still anxious? And unfortunately, the answer is yes, right? And part of the reason is this issue here that we'd love to address. And it's the whole issue of, yes, I see these talented junior women coming in the door, whether it's virtual or in person, but I just don't know how to make the offer. I don't know how to initiate mentoring, and that I don't want it to land the wrong way, right? And maybe gossip will start or something else. So I just stay on the sidelines. And unfortunately, I think too many men make this more complicated than it needs to be. So let me just kind of demonstrate how maybe not to do it, and then maybe how I could do it in a way that would be more useful. So let's, maybe if you can see Dave's picture there on the screen, Dave's going to be my talented junior female colleague, and let me just try this a couple ways. Dave, I'd like to mentor you.
Sounds kind of creepy.
Yeah, it sounds, well, I use my creepy voice, which is a huge problem always. But I, also he's got or she's got no context, right? Why am I offering this? It just came out of the blue. It could land the wrong way. It could be misconstrued. Let me try this again. Dave, hey, I saw you present at that meeting last week. I thought you did a terrific job. I was thinking, wow, the hiring committee sure got it right, bringing you on board. And then I hope we can keep you here. So, if you ever want to drop by and just kind of talk about next steps or where you'd like to go and how I can assist with that, I got an open door. Feel free to drop by.
Thanks, Brad. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and it's in Dave's corner. Most of the junior people I know would eventually take me up on an offer like that. You saw that I was able to sneak in a little affirmation. I think this is not that complicated, and I think men, again, back to exposure therapy, need to work on this. And then Tracy, to your specific point, I still think that some men feel awkward about this, right? And it may even feel more awkward in the virtual world because I don't actually see her around the office, where we could have maybe a kind of a impromptu conversation, getting coffee or something else. This requires me to go out of my way to send an email or, somehow initiate a relationship kind of call or an offer. And I'm worried, that again, because I can't see her nonverbals or can't see how she's receiving this, maybe it'll land the wrong way and I won't even know that. So I still think there are men who sit on the sidelines.
Okay, in our remaining time, we wanted to touch on a little bit of the public allyship and systemic allyship. And this is really where we're starting to put some skin in the game and think about how do we put ourselves out there publicly as we're beginning to do this work. And I'd like to start by giving you a scenario. And this could happen in any organization out there and maybe not be yours, but let's say you're walking into an in-person meeting and there's two men, just happen to be men, standing in there, they're having a conversation. You overhear this as you come in, and you hear one guy saying to the other, he's like, we could have more women in senior leadership roles in our company, but women just don't want to work that hard. Oops, there it is. Boom, that sexist biased statement. You clearly heard it. Others in the room probably heard it as well. What do? If you're being honest and realistic with yourself, what do you do right there in the moment? And we're going to give you some techniques and strategies to do that. But if you want, go ahead in the chat. You can throw in there, what would you do right there in the moment if you heard that kind of a biased statement?
Yeah, I'm curious. So while we're watching for the chat piece, we are going to sort of cover what happens in that meeting when that sexist comment or that harassing joke lands on the table. What actually happens? Well, all the bystander research shows that nothing happens, right? Most of us freeze up. Something called bystander paralysis sets in really quite quickly within about 3 seconds. And if I don't disrupt it within just a couple of seconds, we have a 2-second rule, probably the moment is going to be lost and I'm not going to say anything. So we need to disrupt. And I put this on men more often because when women are a minoritized group in a meeting, and they call something out, they often get pushback, right? They often get labeled as abrasive or hard to work with. Men, not so much. We have very little to fear from disrupting. So we actually have some brave volunteers who are going to unmute themselves. And I want to just set up a demonstration here. This is a meeting, maybe in your company, and you're coming into the meeting, maybe it's in person, and you hear two dudes, Dave and I, having a sidebar conversation before the meeting begins. If you, those volunteers on the call, if you hear something that doesn't land the right way with you, would you give us a loud ouch? The beauty of the ouch technique is it buys me a few more seconds while everyone in the meeting looks at me. And now I have to articulate what didn't land the right way. But the most important part is doing the ouch and breaking the paralysis. So here we go. Hey, Dave, dude, I was in that meeting the other day and that new person you hired, Rashonda, I think her name is.
Yeah.
She gave a presentation that was terrific.
She is awesome. She really knocked that presentation out of the park.
Yeah. You know, if you're coaching her at all, one thing I noticed is it would be nice if she smiled more when she was talking.
Ouch, ouch,
ouch. Yeah, I know what you mean. She can be a little abrasive sometimes.
Yeah. You know, somebody that talented, I was thinking, wow, I'd love to get her over on our side of the business, the international side. There's a lot of travel. Is she married? Do you know?
Ouch.
ouch.
Yeah, and I think she has kids too.
Oh,
Ouch.
Well, but I do mean, you do know she is kind of easy on the eyes.
yes.
Ouch.
Yes. Okay, boom. Thank you, volunteers.
Nice job, everybody.
You nailed the ouching. That was perfect. And I think what you just demonstrated is how quickly I can do that and how efficiently. Now, here's the next part. And this is a challenge as well. You have to have some go-to statements and you've got to be ready to disrupt. You need to be willing to say something about owning it and what's not okay with you. It's not okay for me to say, Dave, there are women in the room, man. You can't talk that way. No, I got to own it. So how about things like, I didn't find that funny. We don't do that here. I don't like the way you just demean my female colleagues. I have to own it. And this can be tough for men. We're afraid of losing our man card or violating the bro code, but this is really important. A final piece of this is, do I confront men immediately in the meeting if I'm a male, or do I go to them afterward? And, you know, I think there's not a right or wrong answer all the time. You have to do your own calculus here. I think that if the comment was very egregious, I think if it's likely to create toxicity in our department or work culture, if this is a guy that I've already spoken to, I'm sorry, I'm calling him out immediately. I'm doing the ouch and holding him accountable. There are other moments where maybe it's my boss. Maybe it's a guy who literally has no idea that what he said was offensive, and he's not a guy who does this very often. That may be a time when I go to him, close the door, and in a spirit of confrontation, just say, hey, buddy, when you said that today, everyone rolled their eyes, especially the women. You need to understand that's not okay. Here's why. I share this with you because I care about you, and you got to get better, or this is going to come back to bite you later on in the workplace.
Another thing that we can be ready for is as we start doing this work and being more public in our allyship and doing the disruption and the confronting, is that somebody's eventually going to be pushing back, or you may get some skepticism around doing this work very publicly if you haven't done it this way before. And it's really helpful to be ready with your why. Why is this important to you? Why are you now doing this work and pushing back on different kinds of biased language and behaviors in the organization? And it could be a personal narrative. It could be something related to your female colleagues at work. It could be something about who you are as a person or as a leader. But having that ready to go can be really helpful, because you're probably going to get a little skepticism at some point.
And Dave, we got a couple extra really nice illustrations of, responses. One, the Socratic question I'm seeing here. So, what did you mean by that? Or can you explain it further? And then, why would you say that? Or what would make you say that? So just simply asking the Socratic question, maybe it's not combative, but it really forces the person to rethink what they just said. Those are great examples. This transparency piece is really important. We've been talking about things like the gender pay gap. We are never going to close the pay gap unless women are cut in on the secret intel about things like salaries. Too often, especially in male-centric organizations, women don't know what other people are making, especially the men on the team. They don't know what the upcoming promotion opportunities or advancements might be. Why? Because men may share this with each other after work or over drinks or in the men's room. If we're not cutting in our female colleagues on the intel, don't be shocked when they fall behind. And this tends to happen very early in their careers, that pay gap begins. So if I really want to show up as an ally, how about not tolerating secrecy about this stuff? Lawyers don't like this. HR sometimes doesn't like this, but Dave and I are big fans of things like salary reveal parties, right? Why don't you host a party after work and everyone agreed to, at a certain moment, reveal your salary? This can be very illuminating for people who have been left behind in terms of where they should be salary-wise.
Shifting into some of the public advocacy functions and strategies here. And one of them that we heard was really about how do we step out of the light, the limelight, especially, that comes to us often. For the majority men out there, often the focus of attention can just kind of come naturally to us, and it tends to overlook women's expertise in the room. And so one of the things we can do when that happens is just very quickly say, oh, I'm sorry, but I'd love to give you my thoughts on that. But Maya is the expert. I'd really like to hear what she has to say. And very quickly, we've just handed her the mic or given her a lateral toss. But we've shifted that focus of attention away from us, decentered ourselves, and really centered the focus of attention on her in this case.
There's a great comment from Keith here about the whole smiling example we use, Dave. And I think, Keith, you're wisely pointing out there really is difference. I have one sibling. She's a Navy captain. She's a commanding officer. She's a rock star. I used to be in the Navy too. No one has ever told me that I should smile more. People tell my sister that, almost once a week. Some dude tells her, yeah, why don't you smile? I'm sorry, we have these weird different expectations of women, and they get held to different standards, almost as though her appearance is there for my pleasure, essentially. And I think that we men don't experience that. But Keith, if you ask this question to the guy who said she should smile more, it would be a great intervention. Yeah, why would you say that and not say that to me? I love that. So let's talk a little bit about sponsorship. And I want to give you a couple examples, one from our interview and one from a corporate group. JP Morgan a few years ago realized they were bringing in lots of talented women and not retaining them or promoting them. And so on exit interviews found that there was no mentoring or sponsoring going on. So they started asking senior men to take a pledge. Would you spend 30 minutes a week taking a junior woman to coffee and just talking about her career and where she'd like to go and how you could contribute to that? Would you spend 5 minutes giving a woman a shout out on a win or an achievement? And would you spend 1 minute telling more senior people about her win or achievement? So starting to get to the sponsorship, JP Morgan is seeing huge increases in the number of women advancing as a result of this. And finally, a personal narrative from somebody that we interviewed, Cheryl Sandberg. Her interview around Athena Rising, around mentoring, was interesting. She said the number one thing I want men to understand about mentoring women is you have to sponsor them. All the data shows women get far less sponsoring, and men can't forget this. If you really want to move the needle on equity and advancing women, you need to be her raving fan. She said, when I first got out of college, my first job was primary assistant to the Secretary of the US Treasury. Everywhere we went, he would introduce me for several minutes and just rave about me, such that it was embarrassing. And I pulled him aside and said, Larry, stop. That's embarrassing. He said, Cheryl, this is sponsoring. You got to get comfortable with this. If people know what I think of you, they're going to want you to work for them too. So, litmus test, I think, for men, are you talking about her when she's not even in the room? Are you telling people how great she is? Are you her raving fan? If you're not doing that, I think it's a huge missed opportunity to really get to more gender balance and leadership.
One quick example of systemic allyship as we begin to think about how does bias operate in our everyday practices to create inequities. And one of these places we see is in the way that we lead and leadership style. And certainly in the research, we find that when women lead in a stereotypically masculine way, so more directive and more assertive using their power, they're labeled your favorite B word, bossy, not the other one. And if they lead in a more stereotypically feminine way, then they're labeled, looked at, this is the more participative, more collaborative, then they're not seen as strong leader material. She doesn't have what it takes to get to the next level. So facing this double bind or having to walk the tightrope between these styles of leadership, whereas as men, we don't experience that very often. We have a lot more flexibility in terms of that. But the question is, where can we see evidence of this play out? And one of the places we find it is in performance reviews, performance evaluations. And this is just one of many studies out there that finds that there's a gender difference in terms of the subjective language we use to describe men and women as leaders and managers. And again, women getting more negative of subjective language and men getting more positive, but even the positive language is different, where we see here women, number one term used to describe them, compassionate, whereas for men it's analytical. So the question is, does that make a difference? Is it valued differently? And there's recent research out of Stanford University that finds that we do see a valuation difference. And when we get to the managerial and leadership level, so it's not about technical expertise, but more about the subjective aspects of who we are as leaders and managers, that this is connected to promotion opportunities, is connected to pay and incentives. And so we can begin to see how this affects systemic inequities like the wage gap and the lack of representation in the senior leadership ranks. Some of the key aspects as we think about our organization and how we can begin to affect change. One is with our senior leaders, and again, making them more comfortable in how they can talk about things like gender and diversity and race in their organization, and really developing clarity around the messaging of this. And this may start with a personal narrative. We find that this develops an authentic narrative for them to be able to talk to managers and really show why they're so committed to doing this work and why it's so important to them personally. But then they have a really good way of turning this around and connecting this to the business outcomes, and so that managers can see, again, in their busy day lives of priorities and competing priorities out there, that this is important too. This is part of my job and my responsibility. And the second part is around transparency. And Brad mentioned transparency around pay, but we also within our organization want to hear about transparency around some of these diversity and inclusion initiatives. How are we doing? How are we doing with things like pay equity? Is that something that we talk about publicly within the organization with employees? Do we talk about how women are being promoted or promotion opportunities within the organization? Transparency builds trust with our employees. The other thing, if we, from an external perspective, if we are publicly disclosing this, it also builds trust with potential investors and our next wave of future employees, especially more diverse employees, are looking. Are you actually able to walk the talk? Is your strategic messaging align with your actions that you have? And finally, accountability. We have to have accountability at every level of leadership to ensure the work is being done. And this can happen in other places like committees and promotion committees, hiring committees, places where decision makers gather, and we can be listening and attuned to, again, where does bias operate, and then holding people accountable for things like, what do you mean by she's not a good fit? Because often that means something like, well, she doesn't have what he has, or she doesn't look like a man in some way, or she's not very likable. And I'm like, well, I'm not really sure what you mean by likability. Is that measured in some way? And where is he on the likability scale? So finding ways to keep accountability front and center is really helpful.
So last couple of things, and we'll see if there's any great questions on your mind. I mean, one is just the way men show up at events that are focused on gender equity, how men show up at their women's ERG events, how men show up as allies in the workplace. We see more women's conferences, having subtracts for men like male champions. And, of course, the beauty of that is men are like, yeah, I'm a champion, I'll go to that, right? So it brings men in the door. But women can roll their eyes and say, really, dude, I got to call you a champion just to get you interested in equity and fairness and really showing up as an ally. So rules for men, when you show up, listen, don't talk, just listen, learn, stay the whole time. Don't presume to take over or speak for women. And then ultimately ask, what role can I play? How could I be really helpful? But don't presume that. Finally, let's not even call ourselves allies. Let's just show up and do the work every day. Let's aspire to be better. Let's learn. Let's receive the feedback. And then if a woman calls you an ally, that's great. But remember, you're only an ally to her, not to all women. So show up with that humility.
All right, we'll turn it back over to our moderators and get a chance, hopefully, here to answer some questions and have a good conversation here.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. We will turn it over to Carissa Coos, who will be moderating our Q&A today.
Hello. First of all, that was awesome. I am so motivated and inspired by you guys. I'm getting a doctorate in leadership and doing research on women's. I actually feel like we need to redefine power for women. So it's interesting to see it from the perspective of how the men feel. The first question I had was, how do you have these conversations with really high level leaders? Like, an example would be maybe like a dean of a business school or something like that. How do you have these conversations then when you feel things are happening? So that's the first one.
Yeah. And so, Krista, do you have any sense with that question? Is it like if I have to hold them accountable or disrupt something, or am I just trying to bring them on board as a...
I can give you an example from my past. For a decade, I worked with toxic leaders, and I know I reacted wrong, but I observed that and learned that it didn't work. But, an example I can think of is I would have a meeting with 10 men that were leaders, and I would have an idea and they would just talk over me. How would you get that what would be your advice to someone who wants to get their point across but isn't being heard? I think that would be a good example.
Yeah. Thanks. That's very tangible. There's so many elements to that and so many different things I think that come up when we're discussing something like that. I mean, number one, if you're a woman and you're in a minority status and you're powered down in that relationship, I think there's more risk for you in calling it out, right? There's that unfortunate data showing that when women call things out or hold men accountable, they often suffer a penalty in their ratings, how likable or, is she prickly or is she leadership material? She tends to take a little hit. Men, not so much when they do that. So we have a little less to risk. So I don't want to put it all on her to have to hold those guys accountable, because there are a lot of men who do interrupt, right, or talk over women. So one of the things I'd love to see is men stepping in there too as great collaborators, because there's probably men in the meeting when that happens. So it's a really easy lift for men or women, if they can collaborate together to say, hey, hold up there, sir. Want to get back to you, but she's really onto something important. Really amplify what she's saying. I'd really love her to finish her thought. That's not a very risky intervention. And then if you have some good allies, again, male or female, who know that this has been happening to you and you've pre-gamed before the meeting, they can be alert to this. And when they see it happen, they can come circle back around and say, Krista, that was a great idea you had a few minutes ago. Could you say more about that? Or I really think that's great. We should run with your idea. If you have colleagues that are amplifying your contributions, that tends to be really helpful too.
Yeah, and it's good that there's attention to it, because it was a decade ago that I worked in management for a decade, and private industry was so hard because there was no awareness. And so they just did what they want. And if they didn't like what you said, they just got rid of you and everybody else that stood up for you. So it's good now. Let me see what other questions. Our research findings, this is actually from Jenny, findings in our Center for Women's Leadership reinforced previous findings that women's primary strategy to advance their career is to work harder, but more work is rewarded with more work. Any insights on that? Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, and I think that's the messaging that not only women, but I think lots of people who identify in different underrepresented minority groups, that's the messaging that they receive, that if you just work hard, everything else will come to you. And I think for so many years, that's what all the advances for women have come through them working hard. And that working hard usually translates into trying to pretzel themselves or adapt themselves into a workplace that wasn't really designed for them to do this. Often it's described as it's a male workplace designed to do men's work in so many ways. And so women have tried to adapt themselves and assimilate into that workplace. And we haven't seen a lot of advancement over the last couple of decades. And I think largely because this is where we need to start shifting the workplace culture. And this is where the everyday practices and the things have to begin to shift if we're going to make any more advances. Otherwise, it's going to be this slow glacial progress that we're seeing. And it's interesting now that, we spent almost, it's coming up on 2 years, it's hard to believe, into this pandemic, that we've learned a lot about the workplace and things about how it affects different people in a variety of different ways. And one of the things that we've learned, I think, is that remote work and flexible work arrangements are important, and there's a lot of great benefits to them. I mean, before the pandemic, those were often very stigmatized and looked at as women's programs. And certainly we did see before the pandemic that women were more likely to use remote work than men were, although men had greater access to it because of the types of positions that they were in. But I think we all understand the benefits of it, including employers, in terms of productivity and efficiency and effectiveness in accomplishing the job. And so as we think about moving forward, I think the lessons learned around things like remote work and flex work arrangements have to be taken into consideration. And then I think finally, there's just a great conversation going on in our country right now that we need to continue around the ideas about paid leave. And when it comes to family and medical leave, parental leave, and we have got to continue that. And I think we now know more than ever that this is critical to the success of our organizations, and organizations that are implementing policy, despite the fact that in some cases, maybe our government will or won't, I don't know, we'll see where it goes, but implement paid family leave, parental leave. But childcare is also important. This is, again, there are lots of great examples of how companies, organizations are taking this on their own and coming up with ways to support not just women, but all their caregivers in their organization, including men, in a way that supports their needs and the demands that they have, recognizing that, yes, we all do have families of some sort. I don't think many of us were hatched out there. So we have families and we do have caregiving responsibilities, and we have to honor those. We can't just turn our head to the side.
Yeah. And, I find a lot of women wanting to prove, that they don't need to be home. And I think redefining that also helps them say, okay, it's okay to be home with my kids or my family. I don't have to work 900 hours a week. Maybe I'll put that in my definition that it has to include. So another question I had is, I'm surprised that you did not use the term unconscious bias to facilitate into a sense of awareness. Is there a reason for that, or that's Keith's question?
Yeah, no. Good question, Keith. Just came down to how many minutes we had, but we certainly could spend an hour talking about implicit bias for sure. I will make a side comment though that we're finding that was super popular to have sessions in your company on unconscious bias, implicit bias. It was kind of all the rage for a couple of years. What we're finding in the research is it makes almost no difference. People maybe in the session go, wow, and then later it just doesn't change their behavior at all. So this siloed training is often not very useful. But there is a lot of bias stuff going on around gender, absolutely. And it's great if men can begin to become more aware of this, have some insight. I'll give you one illustration that we love to share with men. It's all the data on the women are wonderful effect. So that is, if you ask men, give them these sentence blank tests where they have to just project their own answer, what do you think of women? Most men say, oh, women are great. I love women. Women are kind, they're soft, they're caring, they're gentle. But what you're not hearing is what's important. They're leadership material. They're take charge, future leaders of my company. They're competent. You're not hearing those words. And I think men can be surprised sometimes when they look at their own answers. They think they're so positive, but there's a lot of benevolent sexism there, and they're not talking about women's performance and competence.
Love it. So good. Okay, well, we are out of time. I could stay here all day, so I'll have to stop myself.
Thank you so much.
Jenny?
Thank you so much, Chris. Well, it has really been a pleasure. And I really want to call out here, Dr. William Woods made a comment in our chat saying this is some of the best information that I've heard. How you stated it brought it to life in a special way. And I echo that. We have a lot of presentations we're blessed to have at the Center for Women's Leadership. And I feel that this one has been particularly impactful. And we know that our audience is geographically dispersed and across time zones as well. And so many of them will really appreciate the recording that we will share with them as well, so that more people can hear your message and your research and these very useful tips to improve gender equity. So thank you for your time today. I just want to pop up on the screen here a quick reminder about our events coming up in December. We have a community chat that is designed to for our graduate and doctoral students. What are your challenges and support systems? And our community chats are a great way to engage with one another and discuss the real challenges that you're facing, and more importantly, the solutions and support to help you achieve your goals. We also have a workshop called Navigating the Rite of Change, and it is a path to leading well. So a wellness workshop, which I know in the month of December, many of us can use those reminders as it's a busy time of year. So with that, we bid you adieu and hope to see you next month. And a warm thank you to Drs. Johnson and Smith.